When historians argue over Spain's most disastrous monarch, one figure always towers above the rest. No matter which scholar you ask, the verdict is unanimous. No king in Spanish history was more corrupt, more vicious, or more grotesquely twisted in his appetites. Yet the story you think you know about royal marriages, noble dynasties, and the supposed grandeur of European monarchy is little more than a carefully polished lie. The truth is far darker. Ferdinand VII, later branded El Rey Felon, the Felon King, didn't merely sit on Spain's throne. He transformed the royal palace into a house of horrors, a place of debauchery that would have shocked even the most hardened madam in Madrid's brothels. Before he earned his infamous title, he was already notorious as a prince, so malformed in body, so incapable as a man, that even his own mother-in-law wrote letters insisting he was scarcely human. What makes this tale unique is the evidence. We are not dealing with rumors or tavern gossip. This is one of the very few moments in European history where testimony survives from physicians, foreign diplomats, and even the young queen herself, all describing the same appalling reality that reshaped Spain's destiny. What you are about to hear will strip away any illusions you may have about royal power. It is at once pitiful and horrifying, the most infamous case of sexual dysfunction ever recorded in the chronicles of monarchy. To understand how it began, we must step into the royal palace of Madrid in October of 1819. It is a wedding night that would go down in infamy, so disturbing that even the Pope himself was eventually forced to intervene. Inside a chamber, a 16-year-old bride waits nervously. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a convent-raised girl, so innocent she believed children came from storks, clutched a rosary in trembling hands. She had been given no instructions, no warnings. Her German attendants, too mortified to explain the realities of marriage, simply dressed her in white and left her in silence. At last, the door creaked open. What entered was no storybook prince. Instead, the bride found herself face to face with a 35-year-old man, overweight, plagued by gout, with swollen lips and the watchful eyes of a predator. But his appearance was only the beginning. Ferdinand VII suffered from a condition so grotesque that modern medicine still struggles to categorize it. Known as macrogenitosomia, it left his anatomy monstrously distorted. The French writer Prosper Mérimée, who later interviewed courtiers that had witnessed the scene, gave an almost unbearable description. Thin as a taper at its base, swelling grotesquely until it was as thick as a man's fist and as long as a billiard cue. Imagine the horror for a sheltered girl raised among nuns. The young queen took one glance, shrieked, and bolted from the bed in sheer terror. Ferdinand, fueled by wine and lust, stumbled after her. Picture it, a corpulent 35-year-old king chasing his teenage bride around the chamber while she desperately tried to escape. The girl was quick, the king was not. Humiliated by her rejection, he did something unthinkable. He burst out of the chamber completely naked, his deformity in plain view, and bellowed at the queen's attendants. He hurled insults, calling them beasts and whores, and commanded that they prepare the queen for him within 15 minutes. These poor women, including the queen's own sister-in-law, were forced to explain to a terrified child what she was expected to endure. Their words, whatever they were, only deepened her dread. When Ferdinand returned to claim his bride, the scene had descended into humiliation. The girl's fear was so overwhelming that her body betrayed her. She had lost all control of her bowels. The royal wedding bed, meant for the consummation of a dynasty, was instead fouled with human waste. The king recoiled. Disgust twisted his face as he snarled that queens do not smell of civet before storming from the room. For more than a week afterward, He refused to go near her. And for Maria Josepha Amalia, that night was only the beginning of a waking nightmare. To really understand how a royal wedding night could collapse in such a grotesque disaster, we need to look at what Ferdinand VII was concealing beneath those velvet robes. And I'll warn you now, what follows veers straight into the territory of medical horror. Several physicians who examined the king left behind their testimonies, and their words are not easy to read. Dr. Jose Maria de la Fuente wrote bluntly, "His Majesty possesses a member of such extraordinary dimensions that normal conjugal relations are impossible without inflicting severe injury on his partner." But the problem wasn't simply the size. The shape itself defied nature. Do you recall Prosper Mérimée lurid description? Thin like a wax taper at its base, then swelling to the thickness of a fist at the end, and stretching out as long as a billiard cue. Imagine a medieval torture device passed off as human anatomy. It wasn't a gift. It was a lifelong curse, one that haunted Ferdinand from the very start of his adult life. Let's step back to 1702, when the 17-year-old prince married his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. What should have been a celebration of dynastic union quickly became a private humiliation. In Maria Antonia's surviving letters, she describes her husband's fumbling confusion. On their wedding night, Ferdinand did little more than gawk at her, paw clumsily at her breasts, and then freeze, utterly lost. He did not even understand the basics of what was supposed to happen. For 11 long months, that marriage remained unconsummated. The young prince would become aroused, attempt the act, and then falter. His own anatomy rendered the simplest function of reproduction into an impossible riddle. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, wrote letters dripping with despair. "My daughter weeps nightly. The prince feels nothing. All inducements are useless. There is no pleasure or effect. This is an extraordinary and tragic condition for whoever lies beside him." Things grew so desperate that the royal confessor himself was forced to intervene. Imagine the shame. A Catholic priest sitting down with the heir to the Spanish throne to give him explicit instructions on how to perform his marital duty. The story spread like wildfire through Europe's courts. The future king of Spain was branded a freak, incapable of even the most basic conjugal act. When Ferdinand finally succeeded, nearly a year later, the result was a catastrophe. Maria Antonia endured 2 miscarriages, injuries so severe that her body never recovered. She died at only 21, her life and health destroyed by her husband's deformity. And here's where the story turns truly sickening. Once Ferdinand finally discovered how sex worked, he became consumed by it. The death of Maria Antonia in 1806 released him from a marriage bed soaked in pain. But it also unleashed something monstrous. The young prince, who had once been incapable of intimacy, transformed into a king whose appetite could not be satisfied. By 1814, Napoleon had been defeated and Ferdinand returned to Spain's throne. He was 30 years old, pent up by years of frustration, and now armed with absolute power. What followed was a spree of debauchery that would have made even Caligula blush. Each night, the king donned a dark cloak and slipped out of the palace into Madrid's filthiest corners. His destination was often the same: a brothel run by a notorious madam known as papal Malaguine, an establishment so infamous that respectable citizens crossed the street rather than pass its door. Ferdinand rarely went alone. He assembled a retinue of young aristocrats, men as shameless and corrupt as himself, and together they turned the city's red light district into their private playground. And here's where the depravity reveals itself in full. The very deformity that had once humiliated Ferdinand now became his perverse pride. Witnesses tell us of nights so obscene they're almost impossible to picture. The King of Spain, drunk on cheap wine, demanding size competitions with his companions. One after another, they exposed themselves, comparing lengths and girths. Ferdinand always won. His cronies gave him a nickname, El Bien de Dieu, the well-endowed one. He would strut through those brothels, his grotesque anatomy on display, bragging about his prowess. But the boasting was not the worst of it. Ferdinand had developed a fetish so disturbing it laid bare the full depth of his corruption. In his own words recorded by Count José María de Villalobos, the king once bragged, "They leave my bed certain that no other man can give them the pleasure I gave. And do you know what delights me most after possessing them?" Think about this for a moment. The King of Spain, the man meant to embody divine authority, kept a private collection of rags soaked with the blood of virgins he had deflowered. Not heirlooms, not treasures of state, bloodied sheets. He hoarded them like trophies, a grotesque obsession he pursued with the same zeal other monarchs reserved for art or jewels. The irony? While his second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza, was overseeing the creation of the Prado Museum, a monument to culture and beauty, Ferdinand was amassing his own museum of horror, stained fabric locked away as proof of ruined lives. And the prostitutes of Pepa La Malaguene's brothel weren't his only victims. Wherever he traveled across Spain, Ferdinand left devastation behind. In Aragon, a widow. In Seistan, a peasant girl. Inside the palace itself, servants who had no power to refuse him. Each conquest added another filthy rag to his growing pile. Each encounter another notch in his chamber of horrors. All the while, Spain itself was collapsing. As Ferdinand obsessed over nightly debauchery, the nation lost its American empire. Liberal reformers were executed in droves. The economy crumbled, but the king's mind was elsewhere, on brothels, broken women, and his grotesque collection. And yet, this man would take 3 more wives. 3 more women who would learn that marrying the King of Spain meant stepping straight into a nightmare. By 1816, Ferdinand's need for an heir grew desperate. His solution? To marry his own niece, Maria Isabel of Braganza. She was 19, Portuguese, and by the cruel standards of Madrid's court, considered plain. Gossips mocked her with a biting rhyme. Fia, pobra, y portuguesa, chapesa, ugly, poor, and Portuguese suck on that. But Maria Isabel had something her husband lacked, dignity. While Ferdinand crept through Madrid's brothels at night, she devoted herself to culture and learning. She founded the Prado Museum, opened a royal academy to women artists, and tried to bring refinement to a court drowning in filth. To Ferdinand, she was little more than a womb. And in 1818, that womb finally carried a child. Then came the horror. During labor, complications struck immediately. The baby was breech, the queen's condition worsening by the hour. The physicians faced a choice: save the mother or attempt to save the child. Ferdinand's command was swift and merciless: save the child. Cut her if you must. What followed was witnessed by a dozen people, and all their accounts agree. In 1818, surgery meant alcohol, opium, and nothing else. They opened her abdomen, believing her unconscious. She was not. In the middle of the procedure, Maria Isabel's eyes shot open and she unleashed a scream that shook the palace. She was awake, fully aware, as the surgeons cut through her womb. The doctors, panicked, pressed on, but the child had already died hours before. Maria Isabel bled to death on the table, her last minutes spent in unimaginable agony. She was 21 years old. Her sister publicly laid the blame on Ferdinand. Court whispers suggested his deformed anatomy had caused complications in conception. Others pointed to his syphilis, acquired from his countless nights in brothels, as the true culprit behind the stillbirth. Ferdinand showed no remorse. Within a year, he was courting wife number 3. The heir still eluded him, and that was all he cared about. But if Maria Isabel's death was a tragedy, what befell his third wife was something so obscene that even the Pope would be forced to step in. Remember Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, the 16-year-old who soiled herself in terror on her wedding night? That humiliating scene was just the beginning of her ordeal. After abandoning her for a week, Ferdinand finally returned to her bed. But the timid, convent-raised girl transformed the moment he tried to force himself on her. She fought him like a wild animal. She bit. She scratched. She clawed at him with a fury no one expected. And at one desperate moment, she kicked him squarely in his grotesque genitals, hard enough to send the King of Spain staggering and howling from the chamber. But Maria Josepha's resistance couldn't hold out forever. Ferdinand was the king, and in his eyes, she was his property. So he shifted his tactics. Instead of brute force, he tried patience. Every night, he entered her chamber. Every night, she clutched her rosary, whispering prayers, while he attempted to coax her into submission. The queen's greatest defense was not strength, it was ignorance. Maria Josepha had grown up in a convent, so naive that she truly believed babies were delivered by storks. When Ferdinand tried to explain the reality of procreation, she accused him of deception, insisting he was tempting her into mortal sin. God would never create such a vile method for bringing life into the world, she declared. You are testing my virtue with lies. Weeks turned into months. The man who bragged of endless sexual conquest could not bed his own wife. Whispers spread through the palace. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in disbelief. The King of Spain was being rejected by a teenage girl. Finally, Ferdinand reached for his last weapon. He wrote to the Pope. Imagine Pope Pius VII, an old Italian cleric who had survived Napoleon himself, opening that letter. The King of Spain, most Catholic Majesty, begging the Holy Father to convince his own wife to sleep with him. It must have tested even the Pope's faith. The Vatican's reply still survives. It is a masterpiece of papal diplomacy. With delicate phrasing, His Holiness explained that marital intimacy was not just permitted, but commanded by God. Bearing children was Maria Josepha's sacred duty. To deny her husband was to defy God himself. But even the Pope's blessing wasn't enough to overcome her terror. Maria Josepha finally agreed, but only under strict conditions. Before every encounter, she would recite the full rosary. She would keep her eyes tightly shut, and to preserve her purity, she would imagine the Virgin Mary throughout the act. Now picture this. Ferdinand, King of Spain, absolute ruler over millions of lives, lying beside his teenage wife while she whispered, "Hail Mary," full of grace as he attempted to consummate their marriage. Court observers later remarked it was, without question, the least erotic relationship in royal history. For a decade, they endured this purgatory. 10 years of rosary-accompanied couplings. 10 years of a queen lying motionless as a corpse, lips moving in silent prayer, while Ferdinand begged for the slightest spark of enthusiasm. And 10 years without producing a single child. When Maria Josepha died in 1829 at just 25, the official cause was listed as fever. The court, however, exhaled in relief. Ferdinand had failed again, 3 wives, 2 dead, and still no legitimate heir. By now he was 45, ravaged by disease from decades of debauchery, yet still clinging to the desperate hope of fathering a successor. And so, one last chance remained. This time, his bride was Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies. Unlike the innocent girls who came before her, Maria Cristina knew exactly what she was walking into. At 23, she was strikingly beautiful, intelligent, and politically shrewd. She was also Ferdinand's niece, because incest seemed to be the one Bourbon tradition he never questioned. But Maria Cristina was not naive. She had studied the fate of his previous wives and understood that creating an heir wasn't just politics, it was engineering. Enter the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez. After examining Ferdinand and reviewing the medical history of his failed marriages, the doctor reached a blunt conclusion. The problem wasn't just the king's monstrous size, it was the mechanics. He explained it with an analogy. If you want to plant a seed, but the tool is too large for the garden, something has to change. Since altering Ferdinand was impossible, they had to adapt the environment. Dr. Hernandez devised a solution both absurd and ingenious. He commissioned the royal craftsman to construct a special cushion, una almohadilla, made of the finest silk and filled with down feathers. At its center was a carefully cut hole, precisely 4 centimeters deep. The principle was simple. Ferdinand would pass himself through the hole, the cushion acting as a barrier. The bulk of his anatomy would be blocked, sparing his partner the internal trauma that had destroyed previous attempts. Only the very tip, the functional part, would reach where it needed to go. Maria Cristina introduced the physician's solution to her husband with all the finesse of a seasoned diplomat. She didn't present it as a humiliating admission of his deformity, but instead framed it as a medical necessity, something required to ensure strong, healthy heirs for the Bourbon line. Ferdinand's ego, always fragile and easily manipulated, swallowed the explanation whole. Their first night with the cushion was, by all accounts, awkward. Ferdinand, who had spent decades boasting about his monstrous size, now had to accept a boundary, a restriction. But Maria Cristina, practical to the bone, treated the whole ordeal like any other piece of royal protocol. To her, this was not intimacy, not romance, but a procedure, something as clinical and necessary as signing a state decree. And it worked. Within 3 months, Maria Cristina was pregnant. The court collectively held its breath, haunted by the ghosts of dead queens and miscarried heirs. Would this child live, or would Spain once again be thrown into mourning? On October 10th, 1830, cannons thundered across Madrid. The queen had delivered a healthy daughter, the future Isabella II. 2 years later came another child, Luisa Fernanda. Against all odds, Ferdinand finally had what he had chased through 4 wives, 2 deaths, a papal intervention, and 1 bizarre medical device, heirs to his crown. But the joy came with a twist. Spanish law, following the Salic principle imported from France, forbade female succession. By tradition, Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos should inherit. Yet Ferdinand, having quite literally engineered his daughters into existence, refused to let legal technicalities strip them of their right. In 1830, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, overturning centuries of precedent to secure Isabella's claim. When Ferdinand died in 1833, his grotesque obsession left one last scar on Spain: the Carlist War, a bloody civil conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, all because a king with a monstrous deformity had finally managed to father a daughter with the help of a cushion. But before we close the book on Ferdinand, we must return to the darkest part of his legacy, his trophies, the bloodstained cloths. After his death, Maria Cristina ordered a quiet inventory of the late king's private chambers. What the servants discovered inside a cedar chest wrapped in silk defied belief. Dozens upon dozens of cloth squares, each neatly tagged with a name and a date. Carmen, Peasant's House, March 1821. Isabella, Palace Servant, January 1823. Maria, Widow of Vanes, September 1824. The rumors had been true. Ferdinand had been collecting these gruesome mementos for nearly 20 years. Each scrap of cloth represented a woman, some prostitutes, others widows, peasants, or even servants of the court. Some may have gone willingly. Many did not. But the collection revealed something deeper, something political. The dates weren't random. They clustered around moments of crisis. After uprisings crushed, after executions carried out, after liberal reforms strangled in blood. Whenever Ferdinand flexed his iron grip on Spain, he added to his collection. By day, he signed death warrants. By night, he turned his violence on women, crushing political resistance and destroying female innocence. Two sides of the same depraved coin. One entry chilled investigators more than any other. Anna, 15 years, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823. Her father had been among the liberal officers executed after a failed constitutional revolt. Anna had come to the palace to beg for his life. She left with her father dead, and her own innocence obliterated, preserved forever in the king's chest of horrors. This was not simply lust. It was systematic predation. Ferdinand used sex the same way he used the gallows, as a weapon of terror. The liberals he couldn't silence by execution. He shattered through their daughters, their wives, their sisters. The full list of names was never published. Maria Cristina, with a clarity of judgment her husband never possessed, ordered the entire collection burned. But not before several courtiers saw it with their own eyes. Their testimonies matched word for word, too precise, too consistent to be dismissed as rumor. We know the collection existed. We know it was cataloged. We know he labeled them. We know Ferdinand added to his gruesome collection after every wave of political violence. What we don't know, and what history may never reveal, is how many women were forced to suffer to build his private museum of blood. The surviving cloths suggest dozens. The truth was almost certainly worse. Because here's the thing about predators. They never keep records of their failures. For every stained rag that survived in that cedar chest, how many women fought him off? How many escaped before he could overpower them? And how many were silenced forever, their stories swallowed by fear or erased by power? Those secrets went into the ground with Ferdinand, buried alongside the names of victims whose only crime was attracting the gaze of a king who confused power with permission. When Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, Spain did not weep. His own brother declared war the very next day. His daughter inherited not peace, but civil conflict that would ravage the nation. His widow remarried a common guard almost immediately, scandalizing the court one final time. But Ferdinand's true legacy wasn't political. It was personal. He dragged the Spanish monarchy down from a sacred institution to a sordid joke. Every king after him was tainted by his shadow. Every royal wedding was viewed through the lens of suspicion. And his daughter, Isabella II, inherited not only his throne, but his appetites. Her own scandalous affairs, whispered nymphomania, and public infidelities led to her overthrow in 1868. The Bourbon dynasty that Ferdinand had engineered into existence with that silk cushion would collapse under the weight of its own corruption. That cushion, now lost to history, says everything about his reign. A king so deformed that reproduction required an invention. A monarchy so desperate for heirs that the royal bedchamber became a medical workshop. That pillow with its carefully measured hole stands as a symbol of his rule. Power corrupted until it became grotesque, legitimacy hanging not by divine right, but by a slit in silk and feathers. And here lies the cruelest irony. Ferdinand VII is not remembered for any noble deed, nor for building or conquering, nor for uplifting his people. His legacy is his monstrous anatomy and the suffering it caused. He wanted to be el deseado, the desired one. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, proof that absolute power without humanity breeds monsters. Historians agree. Stanley G. Payne described him as cowardly, selfish, grasping, suspicious, and vengeful. Historian J.H. Eliot branded him the worst of the Habsburg and Bourbon monarchs. And the Duke of Wellington, who dealt with him in person, cut even deeper, the most contemptible of God's creatures. All of them were right, and yet none of them quite capture the whole picture. Ferdinand wasn't merely a bad king. He was a predator with a crown, a man who turned his deformity into a weapon, a ruler who collected human suffering as if it were fine art. That is his true legacy, not the throne he forced onto his daughter, not the civil wars that erupted in his wake, not even the bizarre silk cushion that finally gave him heirs. No, the legacy of Ferdinand VII is etched into the lives of women who never got to speak, the servants who couldn't refuse, the virgins who became trophies, the wives who died on the table or endured a lifetime of terror. Ferdinand VII proved something chilling. Monsters don't just lurk under beds or in dark forests. Sometimes they sit on thrones. Sometimes they wear crowns. And sometimes, just sometimes, history is honest enough to remember them for what they truly were. If this story unsettled you, you'll want to hear another about the medieval child bride, a 6-year-old girl forced to marry a 29-year-old king. A reminder that the horrors of the royal bedroom have shaped far more history than the battles written into textbooks.